Hello, welcome to Season 11 of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. This season, in each episode, we will not both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about it later. We have 10 previous seasons of doing exactly that, and it's time for something new. This season, each episode will focus on a larger horror topic, trend, or maybe even rumor. We'll speculate about upcoming movies, debate genre definitions, and do our best to apply the perspective of two people who have watched way too many horror movies to different types of horror media. Thanks for coming along for the ride. So now that we're here in Season 11 and we're getting away from our traditional format of watching one movie per week, we're trying to go a little more scattershot and change it up and look at some like larger trends and things that we're interested in, coming at it from the perspective of all the horror movies that we've watched. So if you're interested in hearing reviews of specific movies, we have 10 seasons worth of episodes talking about those. But today we're going to change it up a little bit and do a bit of a case study in horror television series.
Love it.
And I think that because we've done some kind of like bonus episodes in the past where we would watch, you know, Haunting of Hill House or Haunting of Bly Manor or something like that and talk about those episodes and what they were doing. But I don't know that we've ever stopped to really talk about how different it is to try and make a horror series versus a horror movie.
Yeah. And that was actually something that you brought up, like when we were just trying to discuss, you know, season 11. That was something you kind of brought up, and it's like, you know, that's a really good point. Like, we haven't had the chance to dive in, you know, doing just a handful of TV shows in the past. So this is something I'm definitely looking forward to.
Yeah. And I think that it's a different set of challenges, right? Because like a thing that we talk about a ton is pace and tone in a movie. And for a horror movie to really be effective, it has to be paced well so that it kind of keeps you engaged, but also it can't just go all out trying to keep you like as scared as you can get for an hour and a half, because eventually you just get desensitized to it. So a really good horror movie typically has kind of waves, or it's like that slow build and then the big payoff at the end. And I think that with a TV show, it's totally different, because then you have a bunch of different episodes that all have, you know, 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes to try and almost take you on the same journey, but also accomplish that like larger theme and tone and flow and mood and everything of the whole season. And so it's kind of a unique challenge, and it's almost to me more like a horror book or novel than it is like a movie, as far as, you know, you think about them being similar because they're both film, but I really see the horror elements or the horror presentation kind of being more of that like slow burn, long-term relationship than the quick and dirty movie experience.
Yeah, and I think that's something I kind of realized with American Horror Story is like, you know, part of me thinks like this has to be more complicated in a sense, like you're writing for each episode or for each week, you know, episode a week, and you know you have a big story, kind of like you're talking about. It's almost like a novel kind of thing. I like that option, but the other side thinks like, would it be easier to write like on a TV series? I assume that there are multiple writers, that you could just bounce ideas off. Like, not that you can't do that for a movie, but you know, you can change up the episodes if you need to in a way, and then just add like a horror element towards the end or something and just keep them right back at it, you know, if that makes sense at all. Regardless, I don't necessarily care so much, because I just find this interesting series, American Horror Story.
Yeah. And so for our case study, we did the first episode of season 1 of American Horror Story, which is the Murder House season. And that's one that's always kind of stuck out in my mind. That is the first like real horror series that I remember ever having heard about, which is kind of weird to think of a time when like there weren't just a billion of them on Netflix readily available all day, every day. Mm-hmm. Like it was a show that was on TV at a scheduled time, and you had to watch the episodes in order week after week. And if you missed a week, you didn't really have a good way of, you know, re-watching it or catching up. And this one I remember was actually a pretty big deal. Like I remember it being wildly popular at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, yet again, this is just my thoughts of only watching the first season, because I just never got into it or never watched it. I don't know why. They have the title of it is American Horror Story, so they're expected, like they're putting almost like a target on their back of like, this needs to be horror, and I appreciate that. Like I respect that, because they're saying, this isn't American sometimes horror story. This is American Horror Story, and this is what we're gonna do. And episode to episode, they definitely implement some horror element to it each time.
Yeah. And so I want to come back and talk more about this episode specifically.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I have a couple of like higher level things about American Horror Story that I wanted to bring up that are just kind of interesting.
Love it.
So this is not the only episode or the only season of American Horror Story that I've watched. I've seen several of them, and I have watched this particular season a couple of times in the past. But the thing that has consistently stood out to me as the best part of any American Horror Story season is the intro, the title sequence. And I think that all of the American Horror Story title sequences are basically some of the best horror put on film, because it's a very small amount of time, but it makes you so uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And I know, at least for the first season, I assume this is true in later ones as well, where it's like every image corresponds to something like in the plot of the show. And so as the season goes on, you kind of see more of that stuff. But that was just kind of an interesting thing to me, but to present that and to kind of do that foreshadowing in a way that's also just absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
And one thing I found really interesting was that the title sequence was created by a guy named Kyle Cooper. And he also created the title sequence for The Walking Dead and for the film Seven from the 90s.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm just like, okay, cool. Well, that makes total sense then. This guy obviously has a niche of a thing that he does really well. But then another piece of it that I think is awesome too is the music. And let's see, sound designer Cesar de Villa Irizarry and musician Charlie Closure. But anyway, all that said, I feel like those people do amazing work, and that title sequence is exactly what you want it to be. Because like we were saying, we've got this, it's kind of like a different challenge every week, where like you've got to present a full episode that kind of stands alone, but you've also got some of these like larger horror things going on. And I think that the effectiveness of this title sequence of being so sold out horror really does a good job of setting the tone and like supporting the whole feel and consistently like week to week of that, and helps kind of keep that up. So that's why I wanted to go into that.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, but you hit the nail on the head when you were saying that like it sets the stage for the episode. So like some episodes aren't going to start out with like straight up action, horror action or anything. It's going to take a little bit of time, but watching that kind of just sets the tone, for what you're fixing to see. And yeah, I think you're exactly right that it's on point for what it is. Basically, like the intro is definitely eerie and a little creepy. It's not so difficult to hit the skip, like the auto skip when watching the next episode kind of thing. Yeah. You're just like, I'm good. But it definitely seems like something that would give a child nightmares. You know what I mean?
Oh,
like, yeah, absolutely.
It's on that level.
Yeah, so, for sure. Yeah.
So then the other kind of little background piece I had on this, the creators of American Horror Story were Ryan Murphy and Brad Falchuk. And they also created the series Glee.
Really?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah. And it was just, that's hilarious to me for whatever reason. And I guess they both were like really big fans of the horror genre, but as far as I can tell, hadn't done any work in it before. And so they were, this was just from Wikipedia, but it said they were intrigued by the idea of putting a different angle on the horror genre, stating that their main goal in creating the series was to scare viewers. You want people to be a little bit off balance afterwards, is what Falchuk said. And I think that coming at it from that perspective, it makes a lot of things kind of make more sense with it, because this is a very like professionally done series. I mean, it obviously had plenty of budget behind it. It has some pretty big name actors, especially today, like looking back on it. And I think that it also was just like really well made and very, I feel like it was threading a needle on what you could get away with on TV at the time, while also being super disturbing. And so like there's kind of like the sex and lust element, and there's the like haunting paranormal type element, and then there's also almost kind of like a slasher element to it. And just the idea that came from the people that made Glee, I just love.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, but here's the thing too, like we kind of saw that with Jordan Peele, come from comedy.
Yeah.
That was good, and then able to create like horror. So it's kind of showing like, hey, we're not just like writers, we can do it, and it's proven the point with both cases. But, with this one specifically, I don't know how you can go from writing on Glee. Maybe actually they just hated their life so much because they had to make it so like, I don't know, some of the things so happy in the episodes that you're just like, I gotta start writing some dark shit.
Yeah.
And then birthed American Horror Story.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess kind of getting into this first episode more specifically, it is very ambitious. It covers a lot of ground, and it sets up a lot of different threads to follow. And I really had forgotten that so much of this was in the very first episode. And I mean, I don't know how many pages of notes just to try and capture all the stuff that was going on with it. And I realize as the series goes on, these are just the seeds that all those storylines grow from. But it was really interesting to me to go back and see how much, because I went into it specifically thinking in terms of, our previous episode and talking about horror subgenres and trying to figure out, specifically where this was going to fall. But really, I mean, they pulled off effective horror in lots of different genres. And I think that that's one thing that made it kind of feel fresh, as like a horror series in 2011 or whatever year it came out. It was just like, it did not feel like a genre piece. It did not feel like it was leaning hard into any one previous kind of horror trope. It just kind of pulled from a lot of different things and made you feel uncomfortable along the way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd definitely say like the intro or, the beginning scene where it's back in 73? I think that's kind of what sold me in a way. I don't know, if just kind of seemed super vintage and I liked it. So that piece worked for me. And then, seeing how
and it was also super intense.
Oh yeah, for sure. And you're trying to figure out like what's going on. 'Cause it's like, like it just starts with the action, and you're trying to get it all lined up and figured out, and then next thing you know, you're in present time and figure out about this new family, the Harmon family, and I think I would say probably like by the end of the episode, you kind of you obviously see how it's all tied in together when they move in, but it's just like you're saying, it's cohesive. Like it just worked out. And it's like, I don't know how easy that is, because I'm definitely not a writer, but you're just like, that has to be some sort of, like, that has to be a little difficult to be able to tie, the past to the present and stay like current. Like we saw a really good case of that with Haunting of Hill House, but like, being that I hadn't watched too many horror TV shows, like I had no idea when watching Haunting of Hill House that someone else had done that previously, you know, another horror TV show, and that was, you know, American Horror Story. Now, less in depth on the past, but still important nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely. And I think so I definitely went into this one trying to look through the lens of genre, and it just really wasn't the best fit. What really stood out to me with this was sort of the filmmaking of it and how that was used to complement the horror. And so what I mean there is, like, I noticed several scenes where, like, there's movement, but it's like a few seconds of the film were taken out. So it was just like jerky.
Yeah.
And sometimes that would happen like a few times in a row during a scene. And there wasn't really any reason for it that I could come up with other than just to make you feel uncomfortable. And the way that there would be like the flashes of people. So like when Ben, the dad, has the patient Tate, and he's talking about, you know, his fantasies or his dreams of shooting up the school. And as he's talking, you see like a flash vision of him with blood all over his face standing behind Ben for like just a second, but then it's gone. And then that doesn't come back at all in the episode. Like there were just all these little moments that were really specifically made just to make you feel unbalanced and to make you not feel sure that you understood what was going on. And kind of like all the sleepwalking, and then the way that the housekeeper looked some ways to some people in a different way to Ben. Like it was just weird, and you didn't really know who to trust or what to trust. And so the whole thing had some moments of intense violence. But I think as far as like keeping up that pace, the way that even when it was just people standing around talking, there was still weird stuff going on, or stuff to make you feel kind of unbalanced, or like you weren't really confident what the rules were in this world. And that keeps you like very engaged and very much like paying attention and watching the background and stuff.
Yeah. 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 And then, I mean, the detail of telling the story about wanting to shoot up the school, and then just super eerie, you know. And,
yeah, like horribly disturbing.
Yeah, very, very. And like it makes you uncomfortable, you know, to be kind of watching that, or at least, you know, it did me, where it's just like you know, physically kind of uncomfortable here.
Yeah.
With, you know, this is such a terrible topic. I understand why it was done for sure, and I'm definitely not against them putting it there, but it's just like, I don't want to.
Yeah.
Please move on, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I mentioned before, I feel like if we were trying to put a genre on this one, I mean, it really, really does several of them, and even maybe a little bit like teen horror, wherever that fits in. But I feel like this one is not only for teenagers. Like I feel like it was very kind of like hip at the time, but also it just delivered on horror, and it still holds up.
Yeah, I would definitely say like it definitely had, you know, teen horror, but it was almost like an aggressive teen horror. You know, like you know, the smoking, the fights, just, you know, all the above, like was just like way more aggressive than some of the drama and stuff that you normally see in those movies, for sure.
Well, and I think that's something that's cool too about being someone who, or an opportunity that directors and producers and creators have today, is that they've got like these, you know, over 100 years of horror history to draw from. And you can kind of just take the best or your favorite parts out of like all these different genres and all these techniques that other people have developed or used or perfected over the years, and then like combine that in a new way that's really compelling. And for horror fans, I almost think it made it like more interesting to me than if it was a more straightforward thing. Like I know they made a TV series out of I Know What You Did Last Summer. And I have a feeling I could probably guess pretty accurately exactly what that show is like,
right?
Like the average episode. But this one, you know, I don't know how many times I've seen this season, and coming back and rewatching this first episode was still really compelling to me from a horror perspective. So that was cool.
Well, yeah, and you know, here's the thing, like, you know, when I started watching it in preparation for this episode, you know, I was just gonna do the first one, and Katie had seen all the episodes of this season, and it was one of those where we couldn't stop. watching.
Yeah.
So like we just kept going, but the funny thing is like it was later on, or it was maybe even the next day or something, like we just picked back up and started watching again, and I go to change or something, maybe change my son, and come back in, and like she's watching like a Food Network show, and I was like, hey, what the heck? You know, she's like, yeah, I'm sorry, I just gotta change it. It's getting too dark. I need a break. I was like, okay, that's good to know. Yeah. So, I mean, mission accomplished on that for sure.
Yeah. Did you have any favorite scenes from this episode?
Well, I don't know if I wouldn't necessarily say favorite, but the intensity of them talking about doing the school shooting is obviously ridiculous. The intro scene with the twins going downstairs, I really like, because, you know, like it's definitely like a mathematical equation. Like you have two little shithead kids, and then, you know, go downstairs, you know, like tearing up this house, they go downstairs, they kind of get messed up down there. And I'm not saying just for being a little shit you should get that, but you know, it's formula, right? Like they're not killing off someone you love at the beginning, or right, someone that's likable, you know. So I would definitely say the intro, the school shooting, the intensity that came with that, the uncomfortable part is one of my more favorite reasons, or one of my reasons why I think it's one of my favorites. Yeah, I probably would leave it to that. I would say like there's like a frustration a little bit, like with like I get what the concept is about this season, I feel like, you know, or one of the concepts, but like just the whole maid thing is just kind of throwing me for a curveball at this point. I mean, I get what's happening, but it's just like, okay, whatever. But, you know, we still got a few more episodes to go before we know about everything going on.
Yeah.
What about you? What were your favorite scenes?
So I had two that were, I thought, really good for really different reasons. And they kind of show like how this really like embraces different types or different subgenres of horror. And one was when Violet and Tate kind of conspired to trap the bully, or to, you know, scare the bully off. Yeah. And so Violet, you know, invites her over saying that she has drugs to sell her. And then they go down there and like the light is strobing and Tate's like laughing in that chair and sounds really crazy. But then you're just thinking at that point that, oh yeah, they're just trying to like scare her. But then as the lights are strobing, you almost see like that monster face that was kind of in that flash in the intro. And then he ends up like slashing her face and she runs out screaming. And then Tate just tries to play it off like nothing happened. But just the sound and the lighting and everything about that, and then like the attack and the blood, like all of that was just such a classic sort of, you know, alien monster attack, violence, horror type scene. You know, it reminded me of like in Alien, you know, in the ship or something, when there's like that attack and that intense danger and everything. But also the twist of like, Violet thought she was totally in control of the situation and then realized she really wasn't, and she doesn't know what Tate is now. And, you know, just that everything about that I thought was awesome and intense and like super attention grabbing. And then on the other side, there was a scene later in the episode where the guy with the half burnt face tracks down Ben and tells him that his family's in danger. And then he talks about burning down the house and killing his own family. And just the way that he talked about that, with like the visuals of like the reenacting of that, and him almost just sort of like almost like he was hypnotized or like unable to stop himself, just going through the motions of like murdering his own family and burning down the house. That was so deeply disturbing to me on like a very like psychological level. And just the idea that a person is sitting there like walking out free in the world, like fully aware of that thing that they did that was like that horrible, was just like super creepy to me. And that I would see as more of like kind of the psychological horror. So I feel like this one could go like super violent. It could go very like slasher, creature, whatever, but it could also go much more of that kind of subtle and just like make you really uncomfortable with the way that they're talking and build that anxiety and stuff. And so those were the two scenes that really stood out to me the most, and are main reasons why I feel like this episode has held up well.
Yeah, for sure. There's also like the creepy smile that he gives the dad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's just like, ooh, gosh.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, shoot. Okay, there's ulterior motive here.
Yeah, right. Right.
So, yeah, overall, I mean, I was definitely happy.
I was pleasantly surprised, as I always am when I like go back to something so that we can talk about it. And it's like, oh, I have really pleasant memories. Are they going to hold up?
Yeah.
I think this one did.
Well, I think that's something that we've also talked about. Like, we've thrown out the idea of it, and it was one of those, like, I don't know if we want to watch it under a, our podcast eye that we have to do. We've talked about. I'm glad that we did it.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't think we'll plan to do the rest of this season of American Horror Story as part of this season of the podcast, but I am glad that we watched it, and I would not be opposed to doing something similar in the future where we look at like the first episode of another one and can contrast and compare or whatever. Yeah. So that's kind of the plan.
I like it. I think it's a smart plan.
All right. And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.